Okay, I think we're on now. Okay, and we've got an assignment that's going to be due a week from Friday, right? And you've got an exam coming up. So we should probably talk about preparing and completing the assignment and preparing for the exam a little bit. The syllabus tells a little bit about how how the exam, the number of questions and that sort of thing. Just logistically, on Friday of next week, the 21st, you will go to a computer lab, yet to be identified, but I think it'll probably be over in the classroom building. And some of you have taken exams with me before. You take your exam on computer in a lab, and it's was it stressful for you?
Usually pretty easy.
No problem? Okay. Okay, less stress than a paper exam, I think, because I'm not like, strolling around the room, doing all that kind of stuff. I hate doing that. That's the worst part about doing this job is giving exams. Ugh, I hate that. So the way that you'll take the exam is a lot like if you've taken any quizzes. Anybody taken any quizzes? Have you taken any of the practice quizzes?
Are they up?
I thought they were.
Or would those be?
On the Canvas site, the modules.
Oh, they may be in the modules. I just don't see the quizzes.
They're the modules. Don't see them? Okay, well.
Yeah, what name is it under?
If you go to modules, it should look something like this. And maybe if I'll go to, maybe I'll see what you guys can see. So student view, modules.
That's all I can see.
Yeah.
Aw, come on. Okay. Oh, well, maybe I don't have any. We'll get that fixed. That would make sense. All right, we'll get that fixed. Anyway, what I'll do is, I don't know if we go to the syllabus, go to the syllabus, I'll have something on here about exams. So we got one on February 21st, 80 points of our 640 points. So, it's not huge, but we've had some practice questions to sort of help you to get prepared for it as soon as I possibly can. So, but in addition to that, what's more important are the writing assignments, I think. The exam will cover whatever I've been able to cover so far. So if I've given you an assignment to read like through chapter 10, is that what we were asking? Are we talking about? The chapter 10, and I don't, talk too much about chapter 10. Well, I'll try to give you some kind of breakdown of what to expect. But do the reading, and eventually I'll have some of these recorded lectures available, I hope. If you missed anything, you can check those out. But the main thing I want to talk about is this writing assignment, this first writing assignment, which is the Davy Crockett deal. And let's see, assignments. Don't look at pop quizzes. Yeah, okay, so here we go. What is it? Autobiography of David Crockett. And all of you have selected that's what we were talking about. You were wanting to know a chapter, right?
No, I knew the chapter.
You got a chapter?
No, I was wondering what part of the book.
We need a chapter, okay, all right. I'm not sure if I listed that up there or not, but we'll get you a chapter. And so anyway, you'll read that chapter, and I'm thinking, initially I wanted us to do the Esri story maps. Have any of y'all done that? Not one person?
No.
So if I threw it out as a requirement, then it wouldn't hurt anybody's feelings? Okay. let's just throw that out let's get rid of that requirement. The story maps thing it's just like Prezi, pretty much. It's just kind of, if you know what Prezi was. But all I'd really like for you to do is kind of an outline, and what we want are, where he is during the chapter and chronological place, where does he go during this time, and also try to put some dates with the locations if you possibly can. Sometimes that may not be possible, but all I really want you to know is sort of, track Davy Crockett in your chapter. Where is he? Where is he going? When is he there? How long is he there? So like maybe a paragraph for each location, or a short, annotation or something. And that'll just be, that'll be the assignment. And it's not worth a huge amount of points, is it? You got also the student information essay, right? Y'all done that? So you'll have some writing assignments due on Friday of next week. Again, you only have to read that one chapter that you've been assigned. You don't have to read the whole book. You can if you want. And we'll get that writing assignment in. But hopefully just reading through this has been kind of a learning experience. Written in 1834 by a guy that was pretty famous even in 1834. And of course, he didn't live much longer than that, 1836, March, right? He was not the humblest guy in the world, but he's also reflecting, his own culture, his own prejudices, his own politics at the time, and so keep that in mind. So everybody clear on that? The assignment that is due a week from Friday doesn't have to be anything fancy, just an outline of sort of where and when he is in your chapter. Organize it however you want, but an outline would probably work. I would like for you to tell a little bit about where, at each place. Like when he goes to the Obion River. Is it Obion River in West Tennessee? On the when he's on the big hunt. No, he's actually walks across that flooded area. Remember that? So anyway, I can't remember what chapter that was. So anyway, if you're doing that, then just get that uploaded, turned in, and in terms of a rubric, I'll get you something that'll tell you how many points you'll lose for each misspelling or something like that. But just do a good job on it. And again, I'll try to get these recorded lectures up for you sometime soon. All right. With that, let's go back to talking about the Canal era. Canal era goes, initially I said up to about 1860. And the thing about the Canal era is that most people think of the canals as being sort of this anachronistic way, anachronistic form of freight transportation. But it was actually more common in places like Europe, in Northern Europe, in China, and canals have been around for thousands of years, right? That's one reason that China was able to sort of unify as an empire. They had these that had water access and they could move things around. The Low Countries in North Europe, and the Netherlands and Belgium, and France, Germany, utilized canals. English used a lot of canals. So the first canals in the United States began to appear on a very small scale in places like New England. Right? So initially associated with very early industrial stuff and just moving goods from cities to ports and that sort of thing. So now the thing is that even though canals are kind of an anachronistic or sort of quickly outdated form of transportation, they continue to be pretty useful throughout the latter part of the 19th century and sometimes even into the 20th century. So canals would continue to operate even though railroads, outperformed them. Why is that? Well, oftentimes the canals would continue to serve a certain purpose, even though the new form of transportation was far superior. Okay? And this is a common trend. So I want you to kind of remember that. When did trucking begin to overtake rail transport in the 20th century? The maximum amount, I'm just going to give you a different example. In the 20th century, the maximum rail mileage, freight rail mileage in the United States peaked before the Great Depression, mostly in around 1920, in the early 1920s. And after the Great Depression, after World War II, the actual mileage of railroads has gotten less and less. It's been declining because old rail lines, spur lines, and things are retired, and the steel is recycled, so they rip them up. So there are a lot of former railroad right-of-ways that no longer have rails on them, or they're just closed. Anybody ever run across something like that? Yeah, it's pretty cool. I mean, like you find an old abandoned railroad. Some of these have been paved over in cities to be made into like bicycle trails and stuff like that because they're raised and they're bermed. Pretty cool. But the idea here is that we still have railroads, don't we? Yeah. But we use them for a real specific thing. What is rail transport today mostly used for?
Coal and corn.
Moving coal, things like coal and corn, commodities, cheap, bulky commodities that don't have a lot of, that have plenty of shelf life. They're not going to spoil necessarily. So bulky commodities, gravel, bricks, whatever. Also, other things that are manufactured like lumber, automobiles. So rail transport is now part of a larger system of transport. So if you purchased something at Walmart last night, or like me a week or two ago, bought a new toaster at Walmart. All right, this is my toaster story. Did I tell you about that? Oh, okay. So yeah, you already been there. It was like I almost bought a convection oven, but I was able to control myself, and I bought a $30 toaster. So anyway, where did that toaster come from? And from China, of course. So how did it get here?
Probably by ship.
Yeah, but before it was loaded onto a container ship, right? One of those big, massive container ships. How did it get to the port of Shanghai or wherever?
Sure.
So it was manufactured 300 miles away in some re-education camp. No, it's bad. In the Uyghur re-education camp. Now, actually, maybe it was manufactured in some other inland province. They probably shipped it, probably by truck, to Shanghai. That got loaded up maybe into a warehouse or something. But anyway, they loaded that onto a container ship, shipped it across the Pacific, lands at Long Beach, California, right? At Long Beach, they take the container, drop it onto a truck, send it to a wholesaler, maybe in Salt Lake City or somewhere, who knows. And it would be, maybe it's at Walmart, a Walmart distribution center by that time. And they send it to Bartlesville, right? Bartlesville, not Bartlesville, Collinsville. Is that where the Owasso? Isn't that where the distribution plant, the Walmart distribution plant is around here? So then it goes from Owasso, it gets shipped to the retail outlet at the Walmart out here on 51, and that's where I purchased it. So it's been, and who knows, from Long Beach to a distribution center, and Salt Lake City, it probably went by rail, right? The container got dropped onto a rail car, and then eventually trucked. So it's gone all these different ways, and probably a lot of the a lot of the $29.99 that I paid for that stupid toaster is transportation costs, right? A lot of it. But of course, you can reduce transportation costs by increasing the scale of operation, increasing your economy of scale by, the larger the thing, the larger the vessel you can load stuff on, the cheaper it is. Okay? And that's still the case. Even though container ships are big users of diesel, big users of diesel, they're still about the least expensive way to transport goods long distances. So the point of all that is, in the 1920s, we maxed out on rail transport, but we still use rail today. It's still part of the integrated transportation system. It's just that it's kind of it's been relegated to moving very low value, bulky items in very large quantities, like coal or grain or gravel or sometimes crude oil or refined products, refined liquids. So that's kind of what was going on with the canals. Okay, the canals emerge as an innovative way to move goods, to move grain and people long distances without stopping and relatively quickly compared to going overland. All right. So there, the canals come in the early 1800s as this innovative, faster transportation. The only other way of being either walking or riding a horse or taking a wagon or something on the road. And then the canal era is eclipsed by the rise of railroads. And by that, it's not that railroads didn't exist during the 1830s. They did, but they were very small scale. They were not long distance operations. They weren't very comfortable. They weren't reliable. So the canal era has its greatest effects and its greatest impact prior to the rise of cheap steel and large locomotives and long-distance rail connections. But the canals would continue to serve their purpose even after the rails are connected because it's an integrated network. And, of course, what happens after rail? Well, of course, automobiles and trucking is also complementing all of those things. So canals complement trails, railroads complement the canals, roads, interstates complement railroads. What's after roads and railways?
Flight?
Huh?
Is it flight?
Flight, yeah, jet transport. And I mean, what's the weirdest thing you've ever seen loaded onto a jet airplane?
A spaceship.
A spaceship. Okay, well, yeah, that's kind of weird. But I mean, if you're ever on a plane and I'm real curious, so I always like seeing what is going on into the cargo hold. One of the weirdest things I ever saw was a couple of pallets. You know what a pallet is, right? A couple of pallets of boxes of tropical fish. A pallet loaded with boxes of water got to be pretty heavy. I mean, that's pretty expensive to be transporting on a jet, going across country or something. But, we transport stuff on jet airplanes all the time. Of course, FedEx and UPS have their own fleets of big cargo jets to get things quickly from one place to another. So, now all of these things are, of course, complementing. They're all different forms of transportation, but they're all complementing the same goal. They're all integrated largely. So, and it's just, we refer to this as sort of time-space compression to some degree. Anyway, let's get back to the subject at hand, which is, in this case, the Erie Canal as the best example of, well, what is the significance of the Erie Canal? Somebody tell me. What is so special about the Erie Canal? Why is that the one that we always learned about in elementary school? because it had good songs to go with it. Wasn't there a song or something with the Erie Canal? Where are all the women at today? We don't have any women in this class.
There's only one girl in this class in the first place.
Yeah, but she didn't show up today, so we need to bring her roses on Friday. It's, you know. So what's the significance of the Erie Canal?
New York City.
New York City, yeah. The fact that it gave a gargantuan advantage to one other place, okay? So New York City is the, I don't want to say naturally, you know, well-connected place, but it's the place that benefits from these huge hinterland, the expansion of a gargantuan hinterland. New York City is the benefactor of, or New York City is the beneficiary of the Erie Canal, and it's the ability to connect with so many other places and so many other regions. Okay, so here's the an older map of the Erie Canal, and then sort of a newer map of the Erie Canal. And you notice that it's not exactly the same. Erie Canal is still used, but it's not the same route today, and it's not exactly the same one. And this is the barge canal that still is around. And we'll move on. Okay, now it's another canal. So the other thing about, okay, so if New York gets this great advantage beginning in 1825, New York grows much faster than its other neighboring seaports along the Atlantic seaboard. So Boston is eclipsed by New York. Philadelphia, which had been larger than New York, gets eclipsed by New York City. Baltimore, Washington, D.C., okay, no competition for New York. So New York is very much highlighted or benefited by this connection to the interior. And then in the interior, you've got places like Chicago and Cleveland that are also benefiting from this trade. But those eastern cities were also wanting to connect to a hinterland of their own, not necessarily steal New York's, but they were also wanting to get into the West and have access to natural resources and eventually access to Western markets once population expanded to the West. And here's an example of one that was sort of a competition for the Erie Canal, the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. It's actually the idea of a canal connecting the nation's capital with the interior was an idea that George Washington had actually been pushing. And the construction of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, that is the Chesapeake Bay to the Ohio River, somehow got started in the early federal period and lasted until it was constructed and finished in 1803. So this canal follows the Potomac River from Georgetown in Washington, D.C. You realize Georgetown was a port? Yep. Okay, port of Georgetown. And that would go to Cumberland, Maryland. And then at Cumberland, Maryland, that's the place where the National Road would begin. And I say it's actually Cumberland, Virginia, it's West Virginia, right? And Maryland. So whenever somebody says Cumberland, Maryland, just realize it's the same town, essentially. Now, how did this go? Well, it didn't go very well because, I think, as we mentioned, as a federal project, states were still competing against one another, and cities and industries within those cities were still competing against one another. So it was considered to be it was not very popular at all for all of the states of the Union to finance a federal project that would benefit Maryland and Virginia, right? That wouldn't make any sense. So funding was never very easy. Keep that in mind, okay? That would be another thing that would continue on is, it's always very difficult to get federal funding for infrastructure that is obviously going to benefit one place over another. You know, if it costs, it's going to cost, you know, if we're going to build something, you know, somebody know, what's an example of one of these things? You ever heard of it? You ever heard of the Bridge to Nowhere? What was the Bridge to Nowhere? If you have a chance, Google that. Where do you get for the Bridge to Nowhere? Where, what state?
Los Angeles.
Maybe. This was a,
It's in Los Angeles County.
oh, well, a bridge,
Alaska.
the Bridge to Nowhere was in, that I'm thinking of was in Alaska. And it was, it was one of these things that, I think it was during, was it the Clinton administration? Early 90s? Mid 90s? Anyway, there was a particular Alaska, what?
Representatives or.
Was he a senator or a House? I think he was House of Representatives. But they only have one member of the House, I think, right?
Yeah.
One or two. So they only have one member of the House. And it was his big pork barrel project, okay? So, you know, pork barrel projects are, have become part of, you know, our system, unfortunately. But everybody has pork barrel projects now, right? So what they do is make deals so that everybody has their own pork barrel project. But what we're looking at here is, you know, this Chesapeake and Ohio Canal idea was essentially a pork barrel, you know, special interest project. But at that time, people were, you know, they were cognizant of that, and nobody was, you know, like wheeling and dealing for their particular pork barrel project. Anyway, the National Road was another idea that would, you know, would connect with this, and to make Washington D.C. a port for interior goods. And of course, Washington D.C. never took off really as a manufacturing area at all. Without federal funding, without the ability to get federal funding, what happens? Well, what often happens is the original state or whatever, not in the case of New York, but in this case, they go to the private firm. And so they try to sell it off to a private group who will then capitalize on it and spend their own money on it and maybe utilize the final product. Okay? Sound familiar? What's another example of that? Maybe our town. And if you've ever heard of the term outsourcing, okay? Here at the university, we're at Public University in Oklahoma. And if you were to go back in time 30 years, 20, 30 years, you could go around and you could find all sorts of people employed here by the university who did things to support your life at the university, all right? And those people aren't around anymore. They were university employees that did things like vacuum the classrooms in the evenings, prepare bacon and eggs every single morning in the dormitory cafeterias. Bacon, eggs, pancakes, waffles, all sorts of great stuff, okay? And they were employed. In fact, my grandmother did that for a while back in the 50s. Working for the university, preparing food for the students, okay? Or sweeping the halls, or, you know, cleaning the toilets, taking care of the computers, that sort of thing, okay? Another one is would be like repairing the university motor fleet, motor pool fleet, you know, cars and trucks and everything that the university owns. You got to have mechanics on duty. You got to have people, you know, checking those things out, taking care of them, maintenance, and that. So there's a lot of personnel call it overhead, right? So in about a little over 10 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, it became the norm for universities to get rid of all that overhead. In other words, get rid of those full-time employees who do nothing but fry eggs every morning in the dormitories. Or, basically cafeteria workers. Or in the case of the motor pool, why would the university need to own all those cars? Because, they use them for so long, and then, then they got to sell them, and they usually sell them at a kind of a loss. And so there's a lot of capital moving around. So what did we do? What did we do in the case of the motor pool? Got rid of it. And now we just have, I think it's Enterprise Rent-A-Car or something. And we contract with them to do the motor pool. So we don't actually own the capital, right? So it's been outsourced. And all of the janitorial or custodial work that gets done in this building and throughout campus is all contractual. These are not employees of the university. They're contract employees who the university says, here's our bid, and the person, the company that wins the bid are the ones that have the best rate, right? So this is what happens often when a state or a public entity decides to produce or decides to invest in infrastructure of some kind. If it fails or if it never takes off, then they'll often hand it over to the private sector to do something with. Okay. And that's kind of weird because in Geography 3093, the sequel to this course, the predecessor to this class, we were talking a lot about, were you in that class? Okay. And you were in that class? Okay. We talked a lot about how the state or the crown established colonies, and then when it didn't necessarily, you would have companies like the Virginia Company establish colonies, and when everything failed, they handed it over to the king. So the state kind of took over. Remember that? So, and that was often the case. The crown would come in and step in and take over the colony of Jamestown or the Virginia colony. They would take over authority. But now it tends to work the other way around. The authority, the government authority, can't make it work, so they turn it over to the private sector. And this is still going on. We see it with deregulation in all sorts of industries, like the airline industry. We see it in public universities. Where else do we see it? Where the public sector service, which is non-competitive, winds up contracting out to private sector in order to kind of pick up the pieces. United States Post Office, right? United States Post Office now works for the private sector. They carry private sector mails. They contract so that they can keep, so that they can stay in business. The government monopoly has to go private to stay in business. All right, so the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, this is now a sort of a tourist location. If you ever fly into Washington, D.C., you can often spot it pretty well following the Potomac River. And the green, if you're looking on the map, the green area is the canal. It follows the river right along. Pretty neat. So anyway, it would connect Washington, D.C. or Georgetown with Cumberland, Maryland, way up. And this is a pretty rugged area to build a canal. So the canal actually included things like nearly mile-long tunnel, a 3,100-foot tunnel, had 74 locks, there was over only 184 miles, there was a 605-foot rise. So that's why you have so many locks. So it's slow and it's expensive. And by the time it gets built and opens in 1850, it's already obsolete because of the railroad, okay? Because of the railroads. Now, the Ohio and Erie Canal, this is a little bit different. Ohio and Erie Canal was built in eastern and southern Ohio between 1825 and 1832. So, of course, this is a response, really, to New York and the Erie Canal, right? So 1825 to 1832, that's not very long. And it operated from 1827 all the way up until the Civil War. And then it continued to be used after the Civil War into the 20th century for sources of industrial water. So the Ohio and Erie Canal, now this is actually more of a system of canals than it is one single canal. And I'm going to quickly go back to the map that we had, the canal map, this one, and I'll show you where it is. So the Ohio and Erie Canal is a system of canals that connect ports on the Ohio River, or the Ohio River below Pittsburgh, to Lake Erie, and mostly going into the Cleveland area. Okay, so what city's going to benefit from these canals? Cleveland. And since most of the movement will eventually be going also to the Erie Canal, New York. Okay, so New York and Cleveland are beneficiaries of canals connecting to farmland, especially wheat production land and corn land in eastern and southern Ohio. Unfortunately, I don't have so many photos. We're not really time for the photos, but I visited Canton, Ohio. How many have been to Canton? So have you been to like the Pro Football Hall of Fame? But near Canton are a few little towns that are little canal towns. Towns that got established in the 1820s, 1830s along these canals. And these are just the main lines. There are little feeder canals all over the place that are not even on this map. But these are mostly improved creeks and rivers that allow navigation on very small canal boats. I mean, by small, I mean not too much bigger than, bass boat or something. Or not very, they're actually usually very long, but very narrow. These canal boats would then move agricultural goods or people throughout this system. So, this is mostly before railroads, but then when the railroads did come in, the railroads initially complemented the canals, right, by allowing people to go maybe a short route to the next canal town. So the railroads initially complement the canals, and then later on, when the railroads become long distance, the canals tend to complement the railroads, the railroad movement. I visited a couple of towns in northeast Ohio a few years ago, including a grist mill, a really cool grist mill that was powered by nothing but water. It was a water-powered grist mill, big, massive building. They've been able to keep it preserved and actually working, and they still produce, cornmeal and stuff and flour using these giant stone wheel, stone grist mill wheels. And anyway, and lots of leather belts and pulleys and stuff throughout the whole place. Pretty neat. So they were moving wheat that had been processed into flour. Flour was the primary commodity. And of course, they would ship some wheat that would eventually wind up in the food processing zone here that we talked about, Buffalo and Rochester and Albany and Rome along the Lake Erie system. But agriculture is expanded because of access, because of transport access. That's the key. Agriculture expands west because accessibility is brought in by these different transport systems. The canals are what open up the old Northwest during the 1820s and the 1830s, the agricultural settlement. Of course, farmers could live out in Iowa in the 1820s and 1830s. They can't get their crops to market. So it all matters is what, long distance transport of bulky goods is what matters to allow dense settlement of populations. So the canal era. Let's go back to the Ohio and Erie Canal system. So this is one of the larger and longer systems, 308 miles just for the main route. Big changes in elevation, 1,200 feet, and over 100 locks, and then also feeder canals. The feeder canals mostly moved water into the canal system. You had to have constantly flowing water. So, that reminds me, okay, canals are going to be kind of a problem when you get a little farther west, right? You're not going to have all that water all the time. And you can't really build canals on the western side of the Mississippi River Valley because the water is so sparse and unreliable. You can't even get riverboats up very far on the western rivers of the Mississippi. So the canal boom, we'll read about a canal boom or the boom years of the canal era. And that was mostly not so much a connection of places and accessibility of places for moving freight as much as the construction of the canals. In other words, it was the thing that drew a lot of people in was the need for lots and lots of labor. Canals, of course, if you're going to improve a river valley, and you're not using anything but hand tools and earth movers pulled by mules, okay, then it's a slow process. You got to have a lot of people, you got to have a lot of mules, and it's going to require quite a few increase of population. So this is one of those things where you have a construction boom going on in Ohio and Indiana and Illinois later. And that construction boom is attracting a real specific demographic. It's attracting, about the same demographic we have here, okay? Young men in their late teens and early 20s who are not married and not, no ball and chain on your leg, no ball and chain. Not married. And so you're not established, right? So you're going toward where the money is, where the work is, and where the parties are, right? On the weekends, maybe. So anyway, that attracts a big number of people into the Middle West, the construction boom. In the 1840s, you would have the what's referred to as the Irish potato famine. The problems in Ireland get exacerbated. It's not so good in the 1830s in Ireland because of British control and politics, but then the potato blight hits, and heck, it's like a quarter of the population. Ireland loses like a quarter of its population to immigration. They leave. They go to the United States, largely Canada. But lots and lots of Irish pour in the 1840s, and those Irishmen, very little money, lots of Irish, young Irish males looking for work, and one of the very first places they're drawn into the interior is for the canal construction. Canal construction is a big draw. Okay. Wait a minute. This is north of the Ohio River, right? So that means that the type of labor that is being utilized to produce canals is wage labor, right? South of the Ohio River, there's another form of labor. Would that work for canal construction? Slave labor? Slave labor would probably not work very well for constructing large infrastructure things, okay? Large works, later on in the 1920s, after slavery is abolished, but there are a lot of people kind of still in a situation of slavery, like in sharecropping. A lot of those people would be attracted to very similar types of construction along the Mississippi River Valley and the Delta, building levees, okay, from Memphis all the way down to New Orleans. So, but that was free labor, wage labor, less expensive than slave labor. Okay, so I don't know really why I brought that up, but the thing is, the Irish poured into this area, into the Midwest, okay? And, there was, I'm not saying they're all Irish, but lots of immigrant folks came into places like Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, not just Irish, but from England, from Germany, Scotland perhaps. But they wound up being much of the wage laborers that constructed these canals. Now, once the canals were built, once the canal era was in motion and the infrastructure was there, you had this population that many of them wanted farms, but a lot of them didn't have the ability to claim a farm or to produce a farm. They maybe weren't married, didn't have a lot of help. So a lot of these laborers tended to gravitate toward whatever settlements were nearby. So a lot of the so-called canal construction boom led to immigration to some of the cities like Cleveland and Toledo and Chicago. And so those are the inland Midwest cities that are attracting young men, laborers for other things. So they're attracted to the other jobs, the lumber mills and food processing jobs in those cities. This produces a situation where you have a lot of available labor, okay? A lot of available labor compared to what jobs exist. I'm being very articulate today. What happens to wages when you have a surplus of labor and for whatever work needs to be done? Well, you all live in a college town, right? That's the pristine example, right? That's the best example. It's hard to find a job in this town, isn't it? That pays a lot. So you got a surplus of labor, and that means wages are driven down quite a bit. Well, actually, that was a benefit. That was a benefit for the type of agriculture that would get established in this region. Types of farms, you could grow corn, you could grow wheat. And in the Middle West along the Great Lakes, where you had access to those towns and populations of young working men in those towns that could be hired to produce wheat or to help cut wheat or harvest wheat. Oh my gosh, the 220? I'm sorry about that. All right. How many have been on wheat harvest? Good for you. Wheat, y'all go ahead and take off. I'll just talk while you're moving. But wheat harvest And wheat production is like the polar opposite of, say, tobacco and cotton production, which has to require, there's something going on in cotton production all year long, or plantation cotton. In wheat production, free soil wheat production, you do a lot of labor real intensely for a few months. And then there's not much to do. You wait for the wheat to grow, and hopefully the rain falls and wheat grows. And then you harvest it, okay? But most of the labor needs are all at once during harvest. That's when you hire these people that come out of the cities. So the point of this is that there's a dynamic between what's grown in a region and the labor supply and the population. That's enough. I don't want to make it all. Sorry. Have a great rest of the week.